Born just before the Second World War, she began life in war-torn Germany and ended it alone in a hospital in Ibiza after a freak cycling accident. In between times, she was a singer, songwriter, musician, muse, model and actress, though she's often remembered for being a junkie. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates, and in this episode we delve into the life and times of the artist Krista Pavchin, better known to most of us by her stage name Nico, who, perhaps like some of her contemporaries in the 60s and 70s, who'd been very beautiful, became blamed later almost for growing old and less beautiful. Somebody who, despite being a fiercely independent artist for many, many years, became defined by some of her lifestyle choices. And I'm very pleased to have with us at the Bureau today Dr. Jennifer Otter Bickerdike, rock and roll historian, whose new book on Nico, You Are Beautiful and You Are Alone, will be published later this year by Faber and Faber. It's a very strong biography of a very strong woman. So I'm very pleased to have the very strong author with us, Jennifer Otter Bickerdike. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hello, darling. That was perfect. In one, you got it. Not even my family members usually get it in one after all these years. I'm quite impressed.
Well, I'm impressed by anybody who shares a middle name with a wonderful aquatic creature like the otter.
Well, it's actually my maiden name. And I have to tell you, I went to Olympic trials for swimming. And so for many years when I was training in the pool, we'd be at swim meets and they would call out, in lane 4, swimming for the Cabrillo Threshers, Jennifer Otter. And everybody thought it was like a stage name, but no, it was my actual name. Bickerdike is no joke, though. That's my married name. So, that's commitment when you're taking that on.
Absolutely. Well, listen, let's dive in, Jen. I'm not going to repeat the sort of puff that your publishers say about you or the stuff on your website. Let's hear it from the source. Let's warm you up and get in there with this question to start with before we get on to the subject of Nico and the book. Who is Jennifer Otter Bickerdike? Why don't you tell us yourself?
Well, I'm just a simple girl from Santa Cruz, California. What can I say? I moved here because the short story is I went to Olympic trials when I was 16 for swimming and I didn't make it. And from that, I completely just said F swimming after like pretty much my whole childhood and teenage years being an athlete. And I just kind of dove headfirst into music, and I started putting on shows in my hometown. This is like in the late 80s, early 90s. So it was with bands like Sublime and No Doubt, that kind of ska punk scene that was starting to emerge. And then eventually, when it was time to get a job, I started working in the music industry. And by the time I was 25, I was the head of marketing at Interscope Geffen A&M. And I did that for about 8 years. I left that to help Gwen Stefani start her handbag line, which then eventually turned into her fashion line. I left that to get a master's and also to work at Facebook. And then one of my friends I'd grown up with was murdered not far from my house in San Francisco. And it just was kind of, like that wake up call of what am I doing with my life? And I sold everything I own and moved to England. And the only way I could do that was to either get married to an English person, which I didn't know any, or to get a PhD. So, I did what everybody would do, obviously, is I came and got a PhD. So that's why I'm Dr. Jennifer Otter Bickerdike.
I didn't mention the doctor bit. Sorry about that.
Oh, you bastard. Don't let that happen again. No, it's fine. I really don't care. It's not a big deal.
We listen, we like rock and roll doctors around here, though, because we've had a few, actually. In fact, I had Rob Chapman, who is Syd Barrett's biographer. He's got a doctorate in what he calls Sydology. He actually got his PhD in Syd Barrett.
Well, I was gonna say I'm probably way more rock and roll than him, but we would have to maybe arm wrestle for it because my PhD is in Joy Division and Nirvana.
Excellent. The third rock and roll doctor that we've had, actually, or the first on the show, was Dr. Sam Hutt. Now, you might not know that name. Sam Hutt actually was the rock and roll doctor in the 60s and 70s. He's still practicing, actually. In fact, he ministered to Syd Barrett and Brian Jones and many of those people back in the 60s and 70s. So you're our third doctor, and we've had a couple of OBEs. Now, the thing is, Jen, you didn't mention because that was a very modest summation of your life to date. You didn't mention your books, 2016 Joy Division, The Importance of Ian Curtis, Sorry, Joy Devotion. I beg your pardon.
Joy Diversion.
Diversion.
I made that up. Aren't they so clever?
2014, Second Lives of Kurt Cobain and Ian Curtis again. And of course, 2017's Why Vinyl Matters, your bestseller to date. Paying to the vinyl record. So that's all behind us. But and you also describe yourself as a fangirl, which I picked up a little bit of that then when you're talking about Goldsmiths. But let's just circle back to the subject of the day. What brought you to write this new biography of Nico?
Well, what happened with that is I had finished Why Vinyl Matters, and as an author, you're like, okay, what's going to be the next thing I'm going to do? And I was out in Soho. It's so cliche. It's sad. Drinking wine as one does, and I was sitting there with a friend, and we were just like, okay, what's the next thing I'm going to write about? And I started going through like all of my idols. I'm like, I want to do one on Cyndi Lauper. I want to do a book on Gloria Estefan, like all these things. And of course, there's been like, there does not need to be another book on Gloria Estefan. And especially, I'm going to sound like a complete and utter jerk, but I don't know anyone else. There probably is, but I don't know anyone else that has like worked at a record label building fandom. I mean, that was my job, was to build fandom. So I came in being a fan. My job was to build fandom. And then I went and worked for someone who from an early age, working with Gwen, I had seen her go from being like a kid, like she's older than I am, but like going from being just a girl playing in a band with her brother to being an international icon. I'd seen that firsthand, that evolution, and been a part of that evolution really kind of every step of the way. And then I went to work at Facebook. So it's kind of like I went from the most analog to the most digital. And then I got the PhD. So I was able to kind of study the theoretical stuff behind it. That night after we'd been Soho drinking wine, I went and I just went on Professor Google and I started looking up like, who are the most important women in rock and roll? And it's all, and of course it's like, duh, like people, why didn't I think of like Siousxie Sue, who I worship when I was staying there in Soho? Why didn't I think of Chrissie Hynde, who I think is a complete badass? And then I came to Nico and I'm like, okay, I'm supposed to be this like academic, rock and roller. What do I really know about Nico? I mean, I know like what I knew the most about her was from being a huge Royal Tenenbaums fan. And that amazing scene, like, I mean, for like my whole 20s and 30s, I'm like, I am Margot Tenenbaum, basically. Scene, of course, where like this like adopted brother and sister, they've been lusting for each other forever. They like are reunited. And these days, I'm getting goosebumps is talking about it. These Days by Nico plays. And it's just like...
Well, it's funny you should say that because, that soundtrack, which I love that soundtrack, and These Days, and is it The Fairest of the Seasons? There's 2 Nico tracks on there, isn't there?
Yeah.
And again, I mean, like I said to you earlier, is that I don't know much about Nico and never really followed her actually, and I think that was maybe one of the first times that I heard it in the context of that film, which, as you say, is a bit of a spine-tingling moment. And then, as we were saying earlier, in the context of the Gainsbourg penned track Striptease. But that's enough of that. So it started to percolate in your brain that she was somebody worthy of your attention. And I think the other interesting thing, which we're going to come into as well, is that she's been paid somewhat the wrong kind of attention, and I think, hasn't she? So when you decided it was going to be Nico rather than Siousxie, rather than Chrissie Hynde, rather than any of those other people that you mentioned, was it inspired by that, by hearing it in Royal Tenenbaums?
Kind of, but I mean, let me say it, Siousxie, if you're listening, honey, anytime you want, I'm here for you, girl. Okay, anytime you want. Get my number, holla at your girl right here. Because anytime I would kill for that. And I mean, I still worship Chrissy. I love all those women, and I wouldn't be here without them. But with Nico, there wasn't very much written about her. And like there'd been one big biography that had been written, and it'd been written by someone 20 plus years ago. And it'd been written by someone that didn't really know her very well. And the more I kind of looked into like what was that relationship, I didn't really understand, like, how did he find out the information? It was kind of unclear. And then there was an amazing book by someone named James Young, who actually has become a dear friend of mine. And he was in her band, The Faction, who was kind of the last touring band. So and that book is about his kind of like the trials and tribulations of being on the road of Nico and the last tour she does. So there wasn't really anything written there. So there's this huge like void. And I'm like, why is there a void of this person that's supposed to be one of the most important women in rock and roll. And that like fascinated me, how like this person could be such an enigma, but at the same time be put on this pedestal. And the more I started like looking into it, the more these contradictions were there. Like she, nobody really knew her music, and yet she and no, outside the tracks that we're talking about, and outside of stuff with the Velvet Underground, nobody could really be like, well, these are like my 5 favorite Nico songs. And no, if you said who is Nico, people either didn't know who she was at all, or they like, oh, she's in the Velvet Underground, and they're like, is she still alive? So like, I mean, literally, I think, I can't remember if I made it into the final edit of the book, but like one of my introductions at one point was like, is she like playing fairgrounds doing like greatest hits? Like, has she been on Stars Dancing on Ice? You know what I mean? Like, I didn't really know. And then the more I got into it, the more I was just like, this is such a crazy, weird, unique story. I have to do it. And I was completely sucked in. So that's how it came to be. It was just, it had to be told. And it ended up, I remember I was re-listening to some interviews I did. It took 4 years to do the whole project, over 100 interviews. And I was re-listening to some of the interviews recently, and one of my favorite interviews was actually with Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction. And one of the things I said to him, I'm like, Dave, it is CSI. It is CS motherfucking I doing this, because it's just, there is no information. It's a time we're so dependent on the computer now, you know what I mean? And so any fact, any tiny minuscule crumb would be like an absolute like gold nugget. It would be like the golden ticket in Willy Wonka. And that's, and it's, at one point I had to let go, because at one point I'm like, was literally trying to track like, okay, on December 16th, 1968 at 2 p.m., where was she? And I'm like, okay, I have to let go of that. I have to just try to get the overall, as many facts as I can to form the picture of who she is. It's kind of like, when they find a bone from like a Neanderthal and they make the head, and you're like, well, how do they know the eye color? Well, they probably don't, but they have the general idea from all the information, and that's what I tried to do.
Right, so it's the CSI thing it's a work of deduction, partly anyway. I mean, and particularly because of she's gone and lots of the sources are gone. I mentioned Rob Chapman earlier in his biography of Syd Barrett. And interestingly, the parallel with Syd Barrett would be, I mean, obviously Barrett died 2006, but the musician Barrett seemed to disappear, in the early 70s. And in a way, I think Rob faced the same thing, because everything that really could be known about Barrett was known in some ways. But what had happened is that the facts had been discarded in favour of the fables. And the fables, in fact, had actually grown far bigger than the facts themselves. So, in Rob's biography, it was trying to unpick the man from the myth, and in a way that you've done with Nico actually in this one. But listen, let's just pause it there and back up the truck, as they say, because there may be people listening whose appetite is now whetted.
I think so. Have I convinced you?
I'm convinced. I'm in. But there's might people who are going, Nico who? Who's Nico? So you're probably better placed than most to give us a whirlwind story of Nico. I mean, let's just set that out before we dig into in depth and also into the book. Who was Nico?
So really, you have this girl who is born at the start of World War II, and her first memories are literally of bombs going off and seeing concentration camp victims being taken away to their deaths. And at a very young age, like, she's not even a toddler, and her dad is conscripted to go join the Third Reich. He doesn't want to. It's like, you're forced to go. And what happened to her dad is never really known. They don't know if he died on the battlefield. There's been like different things. I tried very hard to track down what actually happened to him, but there is I couldn't confirm that. I mean, I was literally in archives of Nazi records, and I couldn't confirm it, because he was just cannon fodder to the war effort, you know what I mean, at that time. So, like, you have these, it's horrific. Like, some of the pictures I was seeing of war-torn Berlin, if you're looking at it, when Krista Pafkin goes and her mother returned to Berlin after the war, like, there's just dead bodies everywhere and crumbled buildings, and it's appalling. And to think of, as a little kid, that's what you're seeing, is just, it's it's mind numbing. I can't even really believe, I can't imagine it, to be fair. And I think for the rest of her life, Nico was trying to run away from that history that she inherited, and from no fault of her own. You know what I mean? Um, and her way of getting out of Germany, she just was looking for anything. And when she was probably like a tween, we would say, she decided she wanted to do ballet, but she was too old. She was too old to get started in a ballet career. So the next thing that she decided to try was modeling, because she was tall, she was already beautiful. And so eventually she got discovered modeling, and that ended up being her ticket out of Germany. So she became an international model, and she was pretty much, I just love it, because she was just like, just give me the money. She was just like, whatever the job was, she didn't care what it is. So some of the advertisements, I just love it. She's like, laundry detergent, no problem. You know what I mean? She's like the opposite of, was it Linda Evangelista that was like, I won't get out of bed for X, Y, and Z amount of money? Not Nico. Nico's like, show me the cheddar. Like she just wanted to, get away from the poverty that she'd grown up in. And so eventually I'm trying to go as fast as I can here through the story. Eventually, from the modeling, she runs into the Fellini folks, and she gets a walk-on part that evolves into a bigger thing when the Fellini movie, and that's kind of gets her in with the whole art crowd set.
This is the La Dolce Vita, right?
That's right, with La Dolce, and like it's funny because I had a hard time. This is so not cool to say, but like I had a hard time sitting through the whole movie, to be fair. And the part where she comes on, I can see why it made such a big splash for her, because she just like lights up the screen. Like as soon as she comes on, she's absolutely stunningly beautiful. She's so charismatic. Like it's like she was made to be there. You can totally see why Fellini plucked her out and said, yeah, you have to be here for more than just like a walk-on part. And from that, she ends up she kind of flubs it up, because she gets offered to do another movie right after that. And because she's modeling, she forgets that she's been cast to do another big movie. So she kind of gets blacklisted a little bit, but then she lands the movie Striptease that you and I were talking about. But it's a flop, actually. And she just, during this whole time, she's kind of like, flitting around like New York, London. She's kind of all over the place. But by this time, unfortunately, her kind of look, which is really tall, kind of voluptuous, that is going out, and the very like skinny London look is coming in. And she's already at this time like mid-20s. She's having a lot of problems keeping her weight down. And it's interesting because you hear she talks about like, I was like this big large bird that was like trying to, I eat like one egg a day, and I was just hungry all the time. And it's just hilarious because people don't think of Nico as having a sense of humor, but she really did. And around this time, she had this great knack for always like being at the right place at the right time. And she gets in with Andrew Loog Oldham, who I was lucky enough to interview for the book, a hilarious, funny, sharp man. Absolutely loved him. And he signs her to do a record, I'm Not Saying. And she meets Brian Jones and the Rolling Stones through that. Eventually, she goes to the factory in New York, and that's how she gets in with all the Warhol crew. Andy Warhol sees her and is just like, we need to get her in the mix. He recruits her to come and be in the Velvet Underground. And this is kind of the biggest thing that I think people are going to freak out about, and I might get in trouble with Velvet Underground fans, is that if you start looking back through all the clippings and all the magazines, it is Nico and the Velvet Underground. Like she was brought into that band to be the thing that people looked at in the front of the band.
Right. I mean, we'll like him or loathe him. I mean, Warhol had the eye for bringing people together in that sort of way, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. I love him, by the way. He's like an absolute genius. He seemed to always know when to like step in and help, but then also when to just let people get on and do their own thing.
I mean, he obviously saw something in them, but when she came along, or maybe she was already around, it was his idea, wasn't it, to put her with them? And of course, look what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the way it's been kind of re-envisioned is that she was like this add-on to the band in terms of, well, she's just disposable. But when you start reading back to like the way that it was positioned and advertised and everything, it was definitely, she was the main thing. It was like she was Josie to their Pussycats. Like Josie would not be as good or as amazing. Obviously she needs the Pussycats, but like Nico was the main center of attention. And that's like indisputable when you're like starting to look through archives of stuff. And that I think is something that's kind of been misinterpreted and forgotten in time.
Right. I mean, and this is one of the kind of myths, I suppose, that gets repeated, or the kind of inaccuracies about her life that gets repeated, isn't it? But let's go on. What happens next?
So she eventually, there's a lot of tension in the Velvet Underground for various reasons. She ends up leaving the Velvet Underground. She has this affair with Jim Morrison, which is absolutely a revelation for her because she realizes that she can write her own songs, play her own songs, do her own thing. And between when she hooks up with Jim Morrison and the Velvet Underground, she had done some solo shows in New York, and she had recorded a record, which was other people's songs, which is Chelsea Girl, which is what you and I were talking about. And she'd made a bunch of movies with Warhol. But what Morrison shows her is, you know what, find an instrument that you can play, find your own voice. And it just like, he like sets her free. Like she suddenly, and I think this is such a great lesson for people but women in particular. And I, like, even yesterday I was doing a webinar with a young woman, and we were talking about this. Like there's this weird thing where like women just, they see something. I'm sure it's men too, but I don't know, because I'm only a woman. You see something, you're like, that is so amazing, but there's this weird kind of like hurdle that like you're just like, you can't even think about actually doing it yourself. You know what I mean? It isn't that you think you can't do it. It's like you honestly can't visualize. It's just, I can't. There's like a weird disconnect there. You know what I mean? And Morrison lets her make that connection that she can write music and she doesn't have to do what other people are doing. She can just do her own weird art, and that's fine.
I mean, that's interesting because, of course, you know, we were talking about those wonderful songs on Chelsea Girl. She hated them.
But if you look at the music she makes by herself, it's like no wonder she hated them. Like she's this, and she doesn't like pop music. Like Nico liked jazz. She liked Arabian music. She liked funky songs and classical music. And like if you talk to James Young, like James Young's dream was to do like some music, like choir music or choral music from like the 18th century and reinterpreted by him and Nico, because that's what he and Nico were both into, you know. And the other kind of thing that Nico was really into was the American Songbook. So right. You talk to like Philip Rainford, who was he was in no, not Cabaret Voltaire. He was in Durutti Column. Philip actually was her tour manager and like sound guy on some of the later tours. The two of them would just get together and start singing songs from like the Great American Songbook. So that Chelsea Girl record, that's like nothing that doesn't fall into any of the camp. It's not punk rock. It's not classical, you know, like those kind of classical Americana songs. It's not anything. So I
mean, the thing is, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because obviously they're not her songs. And as you say, it's completely not the style that she went on to do. So it's not really her, of course, but it's still a great record.
It's a beautiful record.
And it's a shame, of course, that she couldn't actually see that in it. But I think this is an interesting thing you say about Jim Morrison, because you're saying that he was there at the right time, and actually, because he, you know, obviously he's had a pretty bad press with the way he treated people and women, hasn't he? But in this case, he seems to have just been sort of alchemical or catalytic enough somehow to give her that boost of confidence to go and do her thing. And of course, this is the time when she starts with the harmonium, an instrument which kind of defines the rest of her solo career, right? And a very unusual choice at the time, because it was completely, well, maybe not with John Cale, but I mean, it was sort of out of bounds for most rock musicians, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because I'm not saying that Jim Morrison it's almost like Jim Morrison is important, not necessarily because he's Jim Morrison, but like you said, he's just that person that sets her free. And I think the reason I think he, in particular, besides giving her that power to kind of make that connection, if you look at her, what is the one thing that she's valued for? It's her appearance. And Jim Morrison is seen as just as sexy, just as hot. He's valued, they're both valued for the same thing. But if you look at it, he's valued for that, but then he's also this like sexy poet, like magnetic, la, 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 la. And if you read like the way that they're written about at the same time, like that's all she's valued for. And that yet his thing is like, you know, think about the pictures we see of course, the famous, like, you know, lion pose and stuff like that. He was her equal, you know what I mean? And like, you read interviews with people that knew them both and knew that relationship. They're saying that like Nico topped him. Nico topped him sexually. Nico topped him probably literally. Nico topped him like in consuming drugs and alcohol. Like she was his equal, if not better. And I would even go so far as a writer, I think she kicked his ass as well. So for the first time, probably in her life, she met someone that looked beyond her looks and it looked inside of her and said, you know what, you actually have a lot to offer. And I think that is, I don't know if anyone else ever really gave that gift to her.
Right. Well, that's all credit to Jim Morrison, isn't it? And also, of course, the other very important person in her life from Velvet Underground on was John Cale, right?
John Cale, from the time Nico meets John Cale in Velvet Underground all the way to the end of her life, he is, I think it was John Donahue from JD from Mercury Rev. He said, you know, out of everybody that is in her life, John Cale waters that flower and lets it bloom and grow. And it's just so true. It's like through the ups and the downs and the drugs and the this and the that, it's John Cale is that constant that is there for her. And so, you know, John Cale, it produces Marble Index. And of course, Danny Fields signs Nico to Elektra and for this record, and it is probably one of the masterpieces, I would say, of the 20th century. It's an absolutely beautiful, very difficult to listen to, iconic album. From the very start cover to the production to the songs on it, everything about it is just insane and beautiful. Of course, what a shocker, it doesn't do well commercially, and it kind of, you know, I think that kind of, and Nico starts doing heroin quite a lot around that time. She ends up moving to Paris to be with Philippe Garral, the filmmaker. And she has kind of this time period, which a lot of people have said in the past is like her lost years, which is like the 70s going into the 80s, where she makes quite a few records. And she makes a lot of experimental films with Philippe Garral. But she, you know, the records are not, they're not sales successes. She's kind of hand to mouth in terms of financially. There's some really, really the sad interviews in the book that, you know, like her talking about going to parties and people are like literally pointing at her and going like, there's Nico. And she's just like going to parties literally to get food to eat. I mean, it's just, it's really horrible.
Yes.
It's difficult to read.
Yeah, so by this time she's kind of lost in sort of junkie life and heroin and on the downer, right?
She does not have money. And it's difficult to read as someone that's worked with a lot of artists that have problems, you know what I mean, that have drug dependency problems. It's hard to read as a woman. It's hard to read reviews of people writing about her at that time. There wasn't that many. There's not very much written about that time period. And a lot of things written are there. I think I found like one woman that wrote about Nico in that whole of all the articles I read, one woman. And I'm not saying that it has to be a woman looking at it, but like everything is just like, she looks doughy, she's nodding off, she's fat, it's dreary. It's just, I'm not saying those things weren't true, by the way. I'm not saying that, but like there's no, if you look at just the way that, and having worked, I'm not going to say people, but some very high profile artists that had equally bad drug dependency problems, they're just not written about in the same sort of way.
So this is one of the things that you know, in the book that you talk about quite a bit actually, is that there's an inequality in the way that she and other women have been treated, and lots of the reviews at this time about her, as you point out, are all about her appearance, about the fact that she's losing her looks. I mean, Warhol himself sort of says some pretty cruel things about her, doesn't he? You know, when he sort of sees her around about this time, quite brutal. And just as a sort of little intercession here before we go back to the story. One of the things that we were talking about earlier is that in the counterculture, which in many ways was extremely progressive, the underground in the sort of late 60s, 70s and on, when it came to the way women were talked about, it was quite retrograde, wasn't it? I mean, there was the Chicks, the Birds and all that sort of stuff, but the women, including Nico and Marianne Faithfull and those other people, they're talked about often predominantly in the way that they're aging, their weight, their looks, all that sort of stuff, which the men don't really get.
You know what? And I think even now we're talking about, you know, 40, 50 years ago, but I don't think really that much has changed. I mean, for me, as someone in their 40s, there's nobody. Who do I look to go, okay, like everybody's like, well, there's Helen Mirren. You know what I mean? There's Helen Mirren. Like, who is there that's like cool rock and roll, aging gracefully, still kind of punk rock? Like, there's not that many people to look to. And if you look to someone like a Kim Gordon or a Chrissy Hynde or a Siousxie, which, Nico is is older than them, really, because that generation looked up to Nico. And Nico didn't really have anyone to look up to. Like, who is it that she looked up to? There isn't really anyone as a woman.
But in some ways, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jen, but it didn't sort of bother her, did it? I mean, in a strange way. I mean, it would be difficult. You'd have to be kind of made of stone for it not to bother you, for people to comment on the way you look and compare you with how you used to look. But at the same time, it sort of didn't seem to kind of rattle her. I mean, she just carried on, didn't she?
Well, you know what? I never met her. I was just a child when she died. But for the people that knew her, I kind of get various, I've read and talked to some people that knew her quite well and said she loved it. She loved the aesthetic of being like, my teeth are not good. I have junky teeth. I have junky skin. I'm wrinkled. My hair is not what it once was. But then I heard from other people like, her ex-boyfriends and people that were more intimate with her, and said that she really did have a lot of problems when people said that she looked not well, and that it really did bother her. So I'm not really sure. I think that it was something, I think in a way, not looking the way that she was expected to look, aka super skinny blonde Warhol factory days, I think it was freeing for her. But I think, I can say this as a woman, it's like, you don't want to be judged by that, but at the same time, you still want people to think you're attractive. So it's this war you're always playing with yourself, and I don't think, I never knew her. I never talked to her about it, but I can't see, like you said, she was human. I can't see it being something that was easy for her either way. And at the end of the day, she wanted to be taken seriously as an artist and as a poet. And that was the most important thing to her, not as a face and not as a visual element, as Warhol calls her.
Right, but I mean, also those two separate things there is the thing about getting old, just aging, which is kind of shameful, getting older. But then there's the other thing, I suppose, in a way that her lifestyle, junkie lifestyle, you can kind of understand why people would comment on that too, because that, man or woman, of course, that's going to have a pretty deleterious effect, isn't it, as well? So you had sort of two things in parallel, didn't you?
But I mean, my question is always, and this, I actually got in a huge argument with Danny Fields last week about this, because
Danny Fields, legendary punk music manager.
Yeah, he was just like, it's all the same, women and men addicts. And I said to him, like, it's not, Danny, it's not the same. He's like, yes, it is. It's all the same. And I just said, if you even look at the people she was around, Lou Reed had drug problems, David Bowie had drug problems, Iggy had drug problems. Iggy will sit there and tell you he did. And they are, like Iggy Pop, I worship and love Iggy Pop, and he's been so supportive of this project, and I would not have gotten this far without him. So, I owe everything to him. But he is held in a different esteem than Nico was.
True, you do say that, actually, and that in a way is, we're on another myth there, aren't we, which is that the men from that time that became junkies, it's had a kind of doomed romance to it, didn't it? So it's part of the whole kind of, Byronic kind of, sort of elegantly wasted, in some ways it's kind of being rather heroic or something in a rock and roll way. And the heroin chic thing applied to the men, but not to people like Nico.
Exactly. And it was funny because I remember when Chris Cornell was somebody that I worked with, and like I used to exchange Christmas cards with Chris Cornell, and someone I really liked and cared about.
Chris Cornell, lead singer of Soundgarden, who had long-term drug problems.
Danny Fields loved Chris Cornell. And so when he and I were arguing last week, I said, Chris Cornell. And Danny's like, oh, he was such a sweet boy, and da-di-da-di-da. And I said, Danny, listen to yourself. What woman, you name a woman for me that you're going to sit there and say, oh, she's so sweet and wonderful, and she is a junkie. Like, you can't. And like, he couldn't name one, but then he kept kind of coming back to his whole, like, they're the same. and yet if you talk to, and like I hung up with him and I called one of my friends who's a well-known female musician, and I said, I could be wrong. You know what? I will hold up my hands and say I'm wrong. Like I could be wrong. I could, because do you know what? I'll tell you this. The main thing that came from writing this book was anger. That's really what I felt when I was writing this, was anger. I am like not some like burn your bra feminist person. I'm not like, in fact, like my auntie and I, like I told, my aunt is my hero, and she and I have gotten in tons of fights about like Me Too. You know, I come from the music business. Like I've had my ass grabbed. I've gone up to guys' rooms and inappropriate things have been, you know, that's just the culture I grew up in. And writing this upset me. This made me angry. Because why is this woman who's making art for art's sake, why has she been cast as a junkie and a slut? And you can't tell me that these men around her are not doing the exact same thing. And yet there's people posters of them on the wall and not her.
Right. So that does actually come through in the book, actually, this kind of rage at the double standards of it.
I wasn't writing it like that. I was writing it because I'm like, I want people to think about, why is it that we're casting her like this? Here's this woman that is like brought up in this horrific, like I can't envision like that. I mean, I hope not very many people have that kind of horror nightmare kind of growing up situation. You know what I mean? And like her whole life, she's trying to kind of like outrun what people are casting upon her. She's a Nazi. She's a racist. You know, I'm sure she has, those things were part of her growing up. So I'm sure a lot of those things were in her mind, and she was kind of fighting against herself her whole life, and to get away from that. Yeah. And what I didn't mention is, you know, she had a son with Alan DeLong, the actor, and there was a lot of problems with that relationship, and Alan DeLong never accepting the son. And there's a lot of inner turmoil with Nico, and a lot of mental health problems. And if we look at if we look at those things through the context of 2021, I think it's hard not to be angry with the way that history has not, you know, examined her before.
Yeah. So, and to compare and contrast again, actually, with Syd Barrett, and you know, there are some comparisons, say, with the way that you and Rob Chapman have sought to, you know, dismantle the myths in favour of the person. I mean, the contrast with Barrett is quite interesting because, of course, he disappeared in the early 70s, effectively, and he'd been this incredibly beautiful, talented, charismatic star. And, of course, he disappears into really a life of, you know, mental health problems, you know, and he turns up in the early 70s. He's the Pink Floyd recording session for Wish You Were Here. He's massively overweight and bald, and, you know, he's lost his looks, etc. And yet, you know, as Rob puts it, the myth after that, he gets mythologized after that into this almost like this kind of gnomic, you know, wise person who's retreated from the world, has seen through it all, and the myths kind of elevate him into being this kind of mystic. Whereas with Nico, it goes in the opposite direction, even though she carries on flourishing as an artist for all those years. The myths about her seem to circulate on the fact that she's not as attractive as she was, and she's a junkie, and she's all these other things. And there's mythologizing in both directions, almost like we need to do that. But both of the actual people involved at the centre of these stories seemed to rather unfairly get eclipsed by the myths that we make of them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was, and this is again, like we were talking about before, why it's a different book. And I've had a couple of people on Twitter say, why should I read your book when there's this other biography out there? And I said, you know, a couple things. Like one thing I really found when I was doing the Joy Division Nirvana PhD is that history becomes history because it's repeated enough times over. That doesn't mean it's necessarily the truth. And I found this because I worked with Nirvana. That was one of the first bands I went on tour with and did stuff with. It was really, really an eye-opener to kind of start delving into what's been written and go, this is interesting, that this is not at all what happened. And it's not just me saying that. I can go to this person that I worked with at the label. I was on tour. You know, it isn't just me being like a cray person. Like all of us remember it, but this is what's been written. And since it's been written, it's been repeated. And now that's the history. You see, right. But you know, and with Joy Division, it's like I wasn't there. I was like I was only 6 when Ian Curtis killed himself, but talking to like Peter Hook, and this will do your head in. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off from Nico, but I'll come back to how it's relevant in 1 second. I was because as part of my PhD, I went every month on the same day to Ian Curtis's grave, and I documented all the stuff that people left on Ian Curtis's grave, right? And because of this, I got to know everybody at the graveyard, as one does, of course, And so the guy that actually cremated Ian Curtis and buried his ashes still worked at the graveyard at the time. And so I was doing a talk or a book signing or something. And this guy, like, years later, and this guy comes in to the book signing and he's like, I know Ian Curtis isn't in that ground. It's not true. All this cray stuff, right? And he's like, I read it on a forum. And I'm sitting there going, I don't know how much more, without being completely macabre, this person actually took the corpse, did the action, took the remains, put them in the ground. I mean, I don't really know like how much more you can get than that. You know what I mean? And like that's how these new kind of all these things get started. And so when it comes to Nico and like why my book is different, because I had that firsthand knowledge of one, working at the record companies and working at internet and see a company and seeing how myths can quickly transform, but also having that academic research background. I wasn't just going to believe something I read in a book because it said it in a book, therefore it must be true. I wanted to go, where does this come from? This person's interviewed. Who is this person? Where did they find this person? Where was this interview take place? Like, what day did it take place? How did you find this person? Like, I wanted to know the details. What archive is this from? Like, what archive did you look in? And I know that sounds like really nitty gritty and like really like granular and anal, but this is someone's life we're talking about, and someone that all this mythology has been built around. And I wanted to get as deep to the truth as I possibly could. And that was really important to me writing this book.
Right. And that's apparent in the book. I mean, again, with Barrett, there's incidents that, became facts, really, that they probably never happened in the first place. Or there's the incident about him, walking onto the runway at Heathrow Airport trying to flag a plane down, which sounds bonkers, but of course it gets repeated enough times and reported enough times that then other writers report it as fact, and it's sort of, before you know it, it's become the truth sort of thing. The other interesting thing, which happened, I think, after Rob Chapman's book, which was supported by Barrett's family and by David Gilmour, who one of the people who knew him best, probably, is that, did it make any difference to the mythologizing? Not really. I mean, you worked at Facebook, so you probably know this, but at the most, there's still Facebook groups out there that are talking about Barrett in that way, that mythologized way. And I know that you've taught and studied fandom, and it's all part of that too, isn't it? This that we're all fans and we need our myths. And I wonder whether there's something positive there.
Well, I was just to say one last thing about the history making. One of the things that happened last week is I had to turn in my final manuscript of Nico, final. And I was on the phone with Danny Fields for 5.5 hours, and he went over my entire manuscript. But this was really interesting because he went over it and he was like, okay, on page 136, it says East 86th Street. Well, it was actually West 86th Street. And it was those little details of things that I'd read in other books. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but like, it's those little details that over time change and mutate until something that's completely different than what actually happened. And that was invaluable to me to getting the truth straight about stuff. And I think that those little details are what can complete. It's like if you're tattooing a portrait of someone, if you just get it off by a millimeter, it changes everything in the story. And when we're talking about fandom, one of the reasons it's not really about Syd Barrett and it's not really about Nico. It's about, and the reason these fan sites don't change, I'm already getting crazy email. I mean, I'm like dreading it. Like I had to change on my personal website. I had my own email on there and I changed it to be my agent's emails because I was already starting to get really insane emails from people. Because it's not really about Nico and it's not really about Syd Barrett. It's about the people that have invested their own egos and belief systems in who and what they thought and think these people are. And that's really what it is. You see people right now, for example, like, so like with Morrissey. Like, I wrote my MA is actually on Morrissey fandom. And people wrap up so much of their belief system in these bands and ideas. And is it really about the bands, or is it about the fact that we look to these people for guidance?
Yeah.
I'm writing a book right now about Britney Spears, and it's fascinating because why are we looking to Britney Spears for guidance? Like, she doesn't have a college education. She got like homeschooled at the Mickey Mouse Club lot. Why are we looking at that as like someone as a good example for kids? It's like, she's an entertainer. And, when you're talking about counterculture, I think the fact that Nico did say, I don't give a hoot about my looks. I'm just going to make music that I don't care if you think it's unlistenable. It's what I like. Like, to me, that's totally inspiring, and that's badass.
Well, that's also counterculture, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so cool. Like, to me, that is amazing. That is like aspirational, not to put two fingers up to what everybody else thinks and just do your own thing. I think is
right.
That is countercultural, and of course there wasn't really a context for it at the time. I mean, in contrast, what were women supposed to do? I was thinking the other day about a contrast to Nico maybe would be somebody like Mary Hopkins. Now, this is no critique of Mary Hopkins at all, but she was somebody who came to fame, and had some hits in the late 60s and early 70s. Beautiful, young, talented Welsh woman, musician, has her time under the spotlight, and carried on afterwards. Did a few things, married a record producer, Tony Visconti, I think, and now had a family. And, she's done things since, but she's, is it effectively retired to the country in, respectable life and all that. It's no critique of her. And I'm sure she's very happy, but it was just, maybe that was what you're supposed to do. Whereas Nico didn't do what you're supposed to do.
She didn't take that path, and there was no one for her to look up to. And she was just like, she must have felt so alone. I can't even imagine how alone Nico must have felt. Like, it just makes me so sad to think about it. Like, abandoned and alone.
Abandoned and alone. And I want to come back to that. You mentioned Manchester in the context of Morrissey, right? But I mean, we've had to zip through her amazing life story. And I think it is very important to say that, as you've said it, repeated in the book, she had a solo career of 20 years. She toured all over the world. She played many, many shows. She released lots of records. She did her own thing. And then in 1981, she moves to Manchester and spent a big chunk of time there, living in some pretty unpleasant surroundings with some musicians, with some junkies, and it seems quite strange somehow. So tell us about that.
My favorite part of doing the book was writing about her time in Manchester. She basically gets booked to do a show up there by a guy named Alan Wise, who was in that whole circle with Tony Wilson, and really just, one of the movers and shakers in that early 80s Manchester scene. She gets booked to do a show with him. He really takes her under his wing. They really loved Nico, and really it was just so genuine, like talking to them about their time being on the road with her. It was really heartbreaking. Like, she literally just would live in a shared house with folks. All of her possessions could fit in just like a bin bag. And yeah, it was quite harrowing, but also really moving to talk to a lot of the people that she was friends with and played music with during that time. She loved it.
She felt like she was at home in some way, right? She felt
like the architecture looked like Berlin. She felt like, she had this great circle of friends who really cared about her and looked after her and took care of her. I would say she had, these were like, it was probably one of the first times that she had a real circle of friends who really honestly cared about her. Like I said, Phil Rainford from Druidy Column, he was a great friend to her. James Young, who was her musical arranger and collaborator, he also wrote that great book, Songs They Never Play on the Radio. He was a good friend to her. One of the Una Baines, who plays in the Blue Orchids, she was a big fan of Nico's, but I would also say a good friend to Nico. And it just, here was the first time she had a circle around her of people that didn't care what she looked like. They weren't there for the fame. they were just true mates. And I think that's actually when she came off the heroin, was when she was under Alan Wise's wing, and when she started on the methadone, and when she started getting, more cleaned up. It was during that time period. And she really finds her community. And I think that's what makes it so sad, that when she leaves, she leaves to go to Ibiza just to spend some time with Ari and get to know her son as an adult. And it makes it that much more heart-wrenching when, she dies.
We should just tell that story because, we've fast forwarded through it. She's been in Manchester. She's been touring the whole time. She's got that kind of community of mates, musicians, and sort of a mentor. And, Alan Wise in particular is a kind of manager / mentor / friend. Strange relationship, isn't it? But and all those people around her. But then what happens?
Well, that was a very strange relationship. I mean, like James Young describes it as, it was like a married couple. And I think Alan Wise really fancied her. And I think he did really love her, but she was like not having any of it. But at the same time, I think that she needed someone to look after her. And I think whether it was a healthy relationship or not, I'm not 100% sure one way or the other. But what I can say is that you could really see how in that kind of environment, she could have really had like a comeback, so she goes with Ari to Ibiza. And Ibiza was really Nico's spiritual home. It's where she was the happiest. It was where she felt the most free. And she goes there she thinks she's just going to spend a couple months, kind of regroup. She wants to write her own autobiography. And I think that everybody around her thought that it was going to be kind of like she was going to go, she was going to chill out, she was going to, just kind of write this book and then come back, do some more music. And it was going to be like this whole rebirth. And what ends up happening instead is one day she leaves on her bike to go into town. Ari is just left at the house. She says goodbye to him on her bicycle, leaves, and that's the last time he sees her. And it turns out that she fell off her bike. She had what would be basically a brain aneurysm, and she was brought to several different hospitals. And because she looked like a homeless person and they thought she didn't have health insurance, they wouldn't admit her to the hospital. And she basically was shoved onto a gurney and just put in the corner at the hospital she was eventually admitted to. And they were just like, oh, you're just some old hippie that has sunstroke. And by the time they figured out what was wrong with her, they tried to find a vein to administer medicine to save her. And she didn't have any viable veins. So she basically just died by herself in the hospital.
I mean, it is tragic and awful, and one has to feel, through all this for Ari. I mean, he had this extraordinary, difficult life, sort of with her, without her, and then this happens, at the end, and I guess her life has defined him somewhat, hasn't it?
Poor Ari. It's just all that anyone ever wants to talk to him about is Nico, and that must be so difficult. Like, what about me? Like, who am I as a person? Like, don't you care about what I have? Your heart just has to go out to that guy,
Very tough indeed. So we're coming to the end, though, Jen, and I think the important thing is that, for me anyway, was that the way you redeemed her life in terms of busting some of those myths, pointing them out at least anyway, and that those kind of contradictions of the way she was keeping. And it did have a kind of happy ending in the sense that she found that community and stuff in Manchester. And the other thing, of course, really is that how inspirational she's been, or she was, even when she was alive. Patti Smith, Siousxie, those other women from that time, and also since, I mean, I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, Morrissey, at the moment, but I mean, she was very influential on him, wasn't she? And Iggy Pop and all those people actually cite her, as an inspiration, and I think that's also a kind of redemption of a soul, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, that was a great part for me, it was really fun talking to people like Iggy Pop, talking to Dave Navarro, and just gabbing with them like a nerd, like a music fan, and just hearing how this woman had changed the trajectory of their life. Or talking to Mark Lanigan from the Screaming Trees about how he discovered the Velvet Underground records in the small town that he grew up in, and how he's like this little weirdo finding these like gems in like a dusty record store. It really kind of shows you like she might be gone, but she's still working her magic. You know what I mean? And that's like really beautiful. I got this. Can I just read you this amazing quote that Iggy gave me about Nico? Would that be okay? This book is not for everyone. Read it only if you are wise or daring. Here is the Odyssey of Nico, oracle to the giants and losers. One day her music will play on Mars. Could I just say one thing that I really want to make sure that you include, though, in this, and that is, there's been a lot of, things that has been written a lot that Nico lies, and like there's a biography out there, it's even called The Lies and Life of an Icon. And I think it's really important. Like I remember when I sat down to talk to Iggy, I said, did Nico lie? And he said no. And it's important to remember, like, who doesn't lie in Hollywood? In Warhol's factory, everything's exaggerated. You know what I mean? And in that time period, especially. And I just remember that was one of the first things I sat and asked Iggy was, did she lie? And he was just like, why are you even asking me that? It's such a strange question to ask, And I think that is something I really wanted to make sure I got across in the book, is that I think to crucify her as a liar and to have that be kind of a main thing that we say, this is who she was, a liar. It's like, really, like, who doesn't kind of exaggerate the truth in Hollywood or in show business, and definitely Warhol's factory. I mean, like, he made up superstars, like their names weren't even really their own, you know what I mean? But the people that actually knew her, she didn't lie to. She had no reason to lie,
Yes, but the important thing also to say is that, she wasn't an angel. I think Barney Hoskins, in his review of your book, says something about, I love this book, but I'm not sure if I love Nico at the end of it. And, a difficult, challenging person, and because that's the danger, of course, isn't it, with the mythologizing, of course, is to maybe, move from one end, which is that this person, was a racist, a liar, junkie, slut, all that sort of stuff, to flip into, no, she was a misunderstood angel and all that stuff. You don't do that either in the book, of course, because she was all sorts of things, all sorts of contradictions, and, like most of us, right? And she was no angel.
No, she wasn't. She was a hot, as we'd say, she was a hot mess. Bless her, as we'd say in America.
All right, listen, Jen, we got there. Thank you so much. So, You Are Beautiful and You Are Alone, the biography of Nico, a redemptive, myth-shattering biography of one of the 20th century's most underestimated creative and artistic forces. And it is, actually. So thank you for the book, and thank you for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me. Out July 1st at good bookshops everywhere.
Go get it. It's great stuff. Thank you, Jen. I'm going to get Jen back, actually. I think she's written all sorts of other stuff, but I'm going to get her on the subject of fandom, I think. Or maybe Iggy Pop. Anyway, so I'll put a link to Jen in the show notes. Also, just if you're interested, Jen's top 5 Nico songs: My Heart Is Empty, Alone, 60/40, You Forgot to Answer, and Frozen Warnings. I would add in there These Days and Fairest of the Seasons from Chelsea Girl. They're in that Royal Tenenbaum soundtrack, and I know that Nico didn't like them, but actually they are wonderful. And the other one, of course, the cracker, I think the very first one that got me interested in her was when she sings Striptease, which is a Gainsbourg penned song for the film Striptease. Jen and I think that was a great film, although it was a bit of a flop at the time. So there we have it, and we will be back next time with more stories from the counterculture, more stories from the underground. You can check us out at bureauoflostculture.com. You can now get this series, the Bureau of Lost Culture series, on all the podcast providers, as well as Soho Radio, of course, Apple, Google, Spotify, blah, 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 all the other places. If you enjoy it, do leave us a review. I'd appreciate that. And, as I say, tell your friends. I am Stephen Coates.